The north is cold and full of whispers.
The ledger room smelled of tallow and old paper, and under that, faintly, of the sea far below where it chewed at the rock's foundations. No windows here, only lamplight, yellow and unmoving, throwing long shadows across a table wide enough to seat 12 men, though only 2 sat at it now. Jon's fingers were black to the second knuckle. Ink, not blood, though Tywin Lannister had told him once, without inflection, that a man who could not tell the difference between the two had no business holding either. "Read it back," Tywin said. He did not look up from his own papers. Jon straightened the ledger in front of him, though it did not need straightening. "House Serret of Silverhill owes 11,000 gold dragons to Casterly Rock, called due at harvest 3 years running, and forgiven each time on your word. In the last year they have failed to send their levy quota to the muster at Lannisport. Their steward corresponds with a cousin serving in the household of Lord Rowan. And in the last of those letters, intercepted a fortnight past, Sir Denny Serret wrote that the West would breathe easier under a lord who did not treat his bannermen like cattle." "And what is Sir Denny Serret," Tywin said, "in that sentence?" "A fool," Jon said, "who has mistaken a debt for a grievance." Something crossed Tywin's face that was not quite approval. It rarely was. "Continue." Jon had learned in 3 years of this room that continue meant show me you understand what you are being asked to do, not merely what has happened. He set the ledger down and folded his hands the way Tywin folded his, though his were a child's hands, and looked wrong doing it. "You will not send soldiers," Jon said. "A siege of Silverhill would cost more gold than the debt is worth, and it would tell every other house in the West that disloyalty is answered with armies, which teaches them nothing except how to hide better next time. What does it teach them, done properly? That disloyalty is answered with ruin," Jon said, "and that the ruin will look to everyone watching like misfortune." Tywin set down his quill. That alone was rare enough that Jon felt the small, cold satisfaction of having said something worth the interruption. "Call the debt due in full, all 11,000, within the month, as is your right," Jon went on. "Serret cannot pay it. He will be forced to sell grain stores meant for winter to cover it, which will draw the attention of the small folk he claims to protect. His daughter is betrothed to a Brax boy, is she not?" "She is. Lord Brax will hear, before the month is out, that Serret's steward has been writing letters that could be read as treason. Lord Brax will not want his son's children carrying that name into a rebellion that never happens, because rebellions that never happen still ruin the men who almost start them. He will break the betrothal quietly and blame it on something else. A slight, an insult at table. It does not matter what, so long as it is not the truth." "And the reputational ruin," Tywin said. It was not a question. It was a test of whether Jon knew there was a third leg to the stool. "A rumor," Jon said, "that Sir Denys keeps his cups too full and his tongue too loose when he has them. It does not need to be true. It needs only to be said by someone whose word is trusted more than his. By the time the debt collectors and the broken betrothal have done their work, no one will remember to ask whether the rumor was fair. They will only remember that House Serret fell apart from the inside, the way weak houses do." The lamps hissed. Somewhere below, through feet of solid rock, the sea kept working at the foundations the way it had for 10,000 years, patient in a way Jon was still learning to be. "No siege," Jon finished. "No trial, no headsman. In half a year, House Serret will be a smaller house with a poorer name, run by a chastened son who understands exactly what it cost his father to write one careless letter, and every lord who hears the story will draw his own conclusion without needing to be told what it is." Tywin studied him for a long moment. "Not the boy, the plan. And if the daughter is destroyed alongside her father," Tywin said, "cast off by the Braxes, unmarriageable, her prospects gone through no fault of her own, does that trouble you?" There it was. Jon felt it before he could stop it. Something small and cold turning over behind his ribs. There and then, not there, a flinch with nowhere to go. He knew what his face was doing before he could correct it, and he corrected it anyway, a half-second too late for it not to have happened at all. "No," Jon said. Tywin's pale green eyes did not move from his face. "You hesitated." "I recalculated," Jon said. The answer did not change. "That is the correct answer," Tywin said, given a full breath after it should have been. He did not say it as a threat. He never needed to. He said it the way he corrected a column that did not sum, a fact stated for the record, and then set aside. Jon understood, with the particular clarity of a child who has spent 3 years learning to read a single unchanging face for its smallest variations, that this had been noted, filed, not forgiven because there was nothing here to forgive, only observed the way one observes a hairline crack in good stone, and remembers where it is. Power without cruelty is a story men tell children, Tywin said, drawing his papers back toward him, the lesson already closing like a ledger snapped shut. Cruelty without discipline is a drunkard's brawl, loud and useless and remembered by no one who matters. What you have just described to me is neither. It is arithmetic. Do you understand the difference? Yes, Jon said. Then you have learned something today worth more than the 11,000 dragons will ever be. Tywin dipped his quill. See that you remember it longer than you remembered to keep your face still. Jon said nothing. There was nothing to say that would not sound like an excuse, and Tywin had no patience for excuses, only for results and the occasional correction of method. The scratch of the quill filled the silence for a while. Jon waited because he had learned that Tywin Lannister finished what he was writing before he finished what he was saying, and that interrupting either cost more than it was worth. Finally, Tywin set the quill in its stand and looked at him, and there was nothing in his face to suggest that 8 years had passed, or that anything was about to change. The year turns within the fortnight and you leave for Sunspear with it, he said. Robert's decree, made the same season Howland Reed's testimony bought you a hostage's life instead of a headsman's block, sends you to Dorne for your 9th year and the 7 after it, ward to Prince Oberyn Martell, as was arranged before you could walk. He said it the way he might have announced a shipment of ore delayed by weather, a fact requiring no more weight than any other fact. You will finish the Serret matter before you go. I expect it concluded, not merely begun. Yes, my lord. Tywin was already looking back down at his papers. There was no more to say, and he did not pretend there was. No word of farewell, no softening of the 8 years that had just ended as plainly as a column of figures reaching its final sum. Jon rose, bowed to a man who did not look up to receive it, and left the ledger room with ink still black under his nails, and a fortnight to finish tearing a house down quietly enough that no one would ever think to call it murder. The ship had smelled of tar and salt for 3 weeks, and then, somewhere past the last gray headland, it stopped smelling of anything Jon recognized. He stood at the rail as the coast unrolled orange and gold under a sun that seemed to sit closer to the world than it ever had over Casterly Rock. The rock had been stone within stone, gray walls holding back a gray sea, lamplight standing in for a sun that rarely reached the ledger room's single high window. Here the light came at him from everywhere at once, off white sand, off the pale gold city rising from the cliffs ahead, off water so clear it looked like it had never held a secret in its life. Sunspear's walls were sandstone the color of a lion's coat, left out too long in weather, and banners hung from every tower, orange and yellow. The sun and spear worked in thread that caught the light and threw it back. The air carried orange blossom and hot dust and something spiced he had no name for, and underneath it all, faint, the copper tang of the sea baking against rock. Jon had spent 8 years learning that stillness meant control. He did not know yet what all this color was meant to teach him, only that his body had already decided it did not trust it. He was still deciding how to stand, shoulders back, hands folded, the posture Tywin had drilled into him until it no longer felt like posture at all, when something struck him hard across the chest and he caught it before he understood he'd caught it. A spear, blunted, ash-shafted, heavier than it looked. His hands had closed around it on their own, the way a man's hand closes around a rail on a pitching deck, before any thought had reached him at all. Good, said the man standing above him on the dock steps, arms loose at his sides as though he had not just thrown a weapon at a 9-year-old's head. Tywin didn't beat that out of you, at least. Jon looked up at him properly for the first time. Oberyn Martell did not stand the way Tywin stood. Tywin held himself like a man carrying a weight he had long since stopped noticing. Spine a rule with no give in it. Oberyn stood like a man who had never once in his life worried that a room might not belong to him. Dornish silk in red and orange, open at the throat despite the traveling dust, a spear slung easy across his back as though it were an afterthought rather than the reason men feared him from here to King's Landing. His eyes were dark and moved too fast, cataloging Jon the way a man reads a hand of cards he already suspects he'll win. You didn't duck, Oberyn said. You caught it instead. Interesting. Most boys duck. You could have told me you were going to throw it, Jon said. I could have. Oberyn came down the last of the steps, unhurried. Then I would have learned nothing about you at all. only about how well you follow instructions, and I already know Tywin Lannister raises excellent followers of instructions. I wanted to see what was underneath that. He tilted his head. Tell me, little lion, how many houses have you ruined this year? One, Jon said, before he could decide whether the question was a trap. Only one. Oberyn's mouth curved, not quite a smile. And did you enjoy it? It wasn't meant to be enjoyed. It was meant to be done correctly. That, Oberyn said, is the single saddest sentence I have heard out of a child's mouth in some years, and I have heard several sad sentences out of children's mouths, believe me. He turned, gesturing for Jon to follow with the same spear still in his hands. Walk with me. I want to see if Tywin managed to leave you with any legs to walk on, or only a ledger where your legs should be. They passed through gates carved with sun and spear reliefs worn soft by centuries of hands, into gardens that made no sense to Jon at all. Fountains running loud and open where any Lannister steward would have called the waste of water an insult to good management. Children's laughter carrying from somewhere beyond a hedge of orange trees, and no guards standing close enough to matter, as far as Jon could tell, though he suspected several were closer than they looked. You hear that? Oberyn asked, nodding toward the laughter. Children, my children, and my brother's children, and the children of my guards, and my cook, and a boy whose father sells fish at the eastern gate, all learning their letters together, eating at the same table, sharing the same tutors. Oberyn glanced sideways at him. Tell me, in Casterly Rock, did the miller's son eat at Tywin's table? No. Did he eat in the same room? No. Here he does. Do you know why? Jon considered the ledger room answer, that it built loyalty at negligible cost, that shared meals were a cheap currency that bought expensive devotion, and understood, even as he opened his mouth, that saying it aloud in this garden would sound like exactly what it was, and that Oberyn would hear the arithmetic underneath it in half a heartbeat. Because it makes them love you, Jon said instead, choosing the truth and the arithmetic both, and watched to see which one Oberyn caught. Oberyn laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. Tywin's boy indeed. Yes, it makes them love me, and a man who loves you will walk into fire for you and call it an honor. A man who only fears you will wait very patiently for the day you're weak, and then he'll put a knife in your back and sleep well that night. Fear is cheap, and it curdles. Love is expensive, and it lasts. My father did not understand that. I have made very certain I do. They stopped beside a low table set in the shade, where a shallow silver bowl held 6 or 7 pale fruits, and beside it a small stoppered vial no bigger than a finger. Sit, Oberyn said. Jon sat. Oberyn did not sit across from him but beside him, close enough that Jon could smell citrus oil on his skin, and picked up the vial, turning it slowly in the light so that whatever liquid sat inside it caught gold, then amber, then nothing at all. Tywin teaches you to break a man all at once, Oberyn said. Debts called, alliances cut, a name ruined before the sun sets on it. Quick, total, and over. Very efficient, very loud in its own quiet way. Everyone knows within a season that House Serret fell, even if they never learn why. He set the vial down between them, careful the way another man might set down a coin he expected to be watched closely. This is not efficient. This is patient. It's poison, Jon said. It is patience, Oberyn said. Given a shape you can hold in your hand, a blade ends an argument in a heartbeat, and everyone in the room knows exactly who swung it. This, he tapped the vial once with a fingernail, can end an argument a fortnight from now, in a city you have never visited, while you sit at supper somewhere else entirely, smiling at someone who has no idea you have already finished with them. Tywin breaks a man so the whole West can watch and learn a lesson. I prefer that no one learns anything at all, except that their enemy is dead, and that the how of it dies with him. He picked up one of the pale fruits, turned it over once, and set it back untouched. Which do you think is crueler, little lion? The lesson everyone sees? Or the ending no one does? Jon did not answer. He was still looking at the vial, small and unremarkable, and catching the light like something with no weight to it at all, thinking that Tywin would have called it a coward's tool and meant it as condemnation, and that Oberyn had just called it patience and meant it as a gift. That night, lying on unfamiliar sheets with the sound of fountains still running somewhere below his window, instead of the grinding hush of the sea against rock, Jon found he could not decide which man had told him the more dangerous truth, the one who had taught him that power was arithmetic, or the one who had just shown him that love and poison could be the same lesson, worn 2 different faces. He did not know yet which of them he actually believed. The training yard's sand was still slick with his own blood, cut clean along his forearm where Oberyn's practice blade had found the gap between vambrace and gauntlet, and Jon did not look at it. He circled instead, breath even, weight low, watching the older man's hips instead of his spear, because Oberyn had beaten that lesson into him 3 years running. The spear lies, the hips don't. You're favoring the left again, Oberyn said, not even winded. 7 years and you still think I can't see it. I'm not favoring it, Jon said. I'm using it. Prove it then. Jon came in low, spear reversed, and for half a heartbeat it worked. Oberyn's parry came a fraction late, close enough that Jon felt the wind of the counterstrike pass his ear rather than his throat. Close enough that a lesser man would have called it a miss. Oberyn only smiled, breathing harder now, and stepped back to give Jon room to understand what he'd almost done. Better, Oberyn said. In 3 more years, you might actually cut me. You said that 4 years ago, and each year I've been closer to wrong. That's the arithmetic your other father would appreciate. They broke for water in the shade of the colonnade, and by the time Jon's arm had been bound and the sand rinsed from his hair, a servant had already laid the ledgers across the low stone table, grain tallies from 3 Dornish holdfasts, a shipping manifest from the Planky town, and beneath them, a private letter from a Lannisport factor that had reached Sunspear through channels Jon had built himself, quietly over 2 years without asking anyone's permission to build them. Oberyn watched him work through the numbers the way another man might watch a hawk being flown, arms crossed, saying nothing until Jon set the quill down. Well, the Lannisport factor is skimming on the grain contracts, Jon said, small enough that Casterly Rock stewards haven't noticed, large enough that in 3 years it would have bought him a house of his own. And what do you do with that? Nothing yet. I let him keep skimming. A man who owes me his silence is worth more than a man who's been caught. Jon looked up. You taught me that. Or he did. I've stopped being able to tell which of you I'm quoting most days. Oberyn's laugh was short, genuine, and a little sad in a way Jon had learned to recognize but not yet to name. That, he said, is either the finest thing I've built in Sunspear or the most dangerous. I haven't decided which. That night Jon could not sleep, which was not unusual, and so he did what he had done 100 nights before when sleep wouldn't come. He walked. The water gardens at night were nothing like the rock's cold corridors. Fountains still ran, torches guttered low along colonnades, and somewhere a hound barked once, and was quiet. He told himself he was only walking. He did not entirely believe it by the time his feet had carried him to the low door beneath the eastern tower that led down into Oberyn's private archive, a room Jon had been permitted into perhaps a dozen times in 7 years, always with Oberyn beside him, never alone. The door was unlatched. He told himself that was an invitation, and did not entirely believe that either. The archive smelled of dust and dried ink, and, faintly, of the poisons Oberyn kept catalogued in a locked case along the far wall, a smell Jon had learned to associate with patience itself. He lit a single candle rather than a torch, because a torch could be seen through the high grate above, and moved along the shelves with the same care he brought to a ledger he suspected of hiding a lie. He was not looking for anything in particular. That was later the detail that troubled him most, that his hand had gone to a specific box on a specific shelf, as though some part of him had known exactly where to reach. The box was plain, unmarked, bound in cord gone brittle with age. Inside, beneath a layer of correspondence about Dornish trade concessions that meant nothing to him, lay a single letter in a hand he did not recognize, sealed once and broken long ago, and a second document beneath it, a maester's record dated 16 years past, written in the careful, deliberate script men used when they knew a thing might one day be read as evidence. Jon read it twice before the words stopped rearranging themselves. Lyanna Stark, delivered of a son at the Tower of Joy, in the presence of Sir Arthur Dane, Sir Gerald Hightower, and Sir Oswell Went, before the arrival of Lord Eddard Stark. The child's father acknowledged by the lady before her death as Rhaegar Targaryen, Prince of Dragonstone. The infant taken into Lannister custody following the deaths of Lord Stark and the remaining Kingsguard. He read it a third time, and somewhere in that third reading, the candle flame steadied, and his hands did not shake, which surprised him more than the words themselves. He had spent 16 years being told he was Jon Sand, a bastard of no house, a hostage raised into usefulness because a king had lacked the stomach to kill an infant outright. He had built an entire understanding of himself, brick by careful brick, on that foundation, and here, in a box he had not been meant to find, that foundation dissolved into something else entirely, not less than what he'd been, but more, and stranger, and worth infinitely more to the men who would want to control it. There was no grief in it. He noted that, clinically, the way he'd note an error in a column of figures, and found the absence of grief more interesting than grief itself would have been. Somewhere a boy raised only on Dornish songs might have wept for a mother he never knew, or raged at the father who'd gotten himself killed chasing a war neither of his fathers by blood had started. Jon felt none of that. He felt the letter's weight in his hands the way he felt the weight of a ledger that had just told him a debtor was worth 3 times what he'd assumed. Targaryen blood. Not a hostage, an heir. He was still holding both documents, still turning that single fact over to find its edges, when the candlelight shifted and a shadow fell across the page, and he knew before he looked up that he had not been quiet enough, or that he had never once, in 7 years, actually been alone in this room at all. Oberyn stood in the doorway, unarmed, unhurried, his face unreadable in a way Jon had rarely seen it. Not the sly, cataloging look of the training yard, but something older and more careful. "I wondered how long it would take you," Oberyn said. "You left it unlocked. I left it unlocked 7 years ago, and have relocked it every night since, until tonight." Oberyn came into the room slowly, glancing once at the letter in Jon's hands rather than reaching for it. "Which tells you something if you're paying attention. I don't do anything by accident, little dragon. Not even the things that look like accidents. You wanted me to find it. I wanted to see what you'd do when you found it." Oberyn sat on the edge of the archive table, arms loose, watching him the way he'd watched him circle in the sand that afternoon. Most men, learning their whole life was a lie built over a murdered prince's blood, would weep or rage or run to find someone to forgive them for existing. You've been standing there for the better part of an hour, and you haven't shed a single tear. Tell me what you're actually thinking, and don't waste my time being clever about it. Jon set the letter down on the table between them, careful the way Oberyn had once set down a vial of poison to see if Jon understood what he was being shown. "I'm thinking," Jon said, "that a hostage has nothing to bargain with. An heir has everything." He looked up. "I'm thinking Robert's decree stripped a name off me that was never mine to lose in the first place, and that nobody in King's Landing knows it yet." Something moved behind Oberyn's eyes. Not quite pride, not quite caution, some third thing Jon didn't have a word for. "And what will you do with that, now that you know it?" "Nothing," Jon said. "Not yet. I'll carry it south with me and say nothing at all until the day it's worth more than my silence." He met Oberyn's gaze steadily across the candlelight. "You taught me that too, or he did. I've genuinely stopped being able to tell." The Raven had reached Sunspear a month before Jon's own ship did, carrying a message shorter than the paper it was written on deserved. "The boy is grown. Send him, Robert by the grace of the gods, king of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men." Oberyn had read it aloud once in the shade of the water gardens, and then set it down as though it weighed more than its size suggested. No summons for the man raised him, he'd said. No word to the woman who never met him, just send him like a shipment of ore. He'd looked at Jon for a long moment after that. "Robert Baratheon has spent 16 years not thinking about you, little dragon. That letter tells me he's finally started." The voyage north had taken the better part of a month, and Jon had spent most of it on deck rather than below, watching the coastline change from Dornish gold to the greener hills of the Reach, and then to the gray stone teeth of the Stormlands, thinking less about the sea than about the 2 names he now carried, and the fact that only one of them would be spoken aloud when he arrived. He had chosen the procession himself, over the objection of the Lannister steward sent to escort him, and the amused silence of the Martell guard captain who had. 10 men in Lannister crimson rode ahead, lion sigils bright on their breasts. 10 more in Martell orange rode behind, sun and spear banners snapping in the wind off the bay. Jon rode between them, in neither color, in plain dark leather with a spear across his back that had been forged in Dorne, and a mine that had been forged in equal measure in a ledger room in the west. He watched King's Landing's gates swallow the column, and felt, for the first time in his life, an entire city turn to look at him at once. The whispering started before he'd crossed half the length of the street leading to the Red Keep. He heard fragments of it. The bastard, the ward, Tywin's boy, Oberyn's boy, which is he, whose is he, and understood that the confusion itself was the point, that a boy who arrived flanked by 2 houses that hated each other was a puzzle no small folk gossip could solve, and that every lord watching from a window above the street was already trying to solve it anyway. The Red Keep's throne room received him alone. No procession here, only a long walk across cold stone toward a throne built of 1,000 blades, with a fat red-faced man slouched sideways across it as though it were a chair he'd grown too large and too tired for. Robert Baratheon did not rise. He looked Jon over the way a man might look over a horse he half-remembered buying, searching for some feature that would confirm the memory. "Gods," Robert said at last, "you've got her look about you. Around the eyes." His voice had none of the warmth the words might have carried in another mouth, only a kind of tired surprise, as though he'd expected the years to have scrubbed that resemblance away and was irritated to find they hadn't. "Your Grace," Jon said, and inclined his head exactly as far as the etiquette masters at Casterly Rock had drilled into him, no farther. "Don't do that." Robert waved a heavy hand. "Don't your Grace me like I'm some Southron lord you're measuring for a bribe. I knew your—" He stopped himself, and something crossed his face that might, in a smaller man, have been called shame, and in Robert only looked like indigestion. "I knew Lyanna Stark since before you were a thought in anyone's head. Don't stand there like a Lannister clerk reading me a tax roll." "I don't know how else to stand, your Grace," Jon said. "No one ever taught me the other way." Robert's jaw worked once, and for a moment the King of the Seven Kingdoms looked less like a king than like a man being handed a bill he'd been avoiding for 16 years. "No," he said, "I suppose they didn't. That's on me, that is." He reached for the flagon of wine set beside the throne, poured with a hand not quite steady, and drank before he spoke again. "You know why I sent you where I sent you?" "Because killing an infant in the street would have made you look like Aerys," Jon said, "and letting him grow up as a lord's son in plain sight would have made you look like a fool waiting to be knifed in his sleep. Split wardship solved both problems and cost you nothing but a letter." Robert stared at him. Whatever answer he had braced for, it plainly hadn't been that one, delivered without heat, without accusation the way a man recites a column of figures he's already checked twice. "Tywin's boy indeed," Robert said, and there was something almost like a laugh in it, dry and humorless. "Ned would have—" He stopped again, and this time the stopping had weight to it, a door closing on something he had no intention of opening in front of a boy he'd exiled twice over before either of them had ever met properly. "Never mind what Ned would have. He's dead. Your mother's dead. I did what I did because it was the only choice that let you live and let me sleep, and I'll not apologize for a king's choice to a boy who's never had to make one." "I haven't asked you to," Jon said. That seemed to satisfy something in Robert more than any amount of gratitude would have. He grunted, drank again, and gestured with the flagon toward the throne behind him, its blades catching torchlight in 100 uneven edges. "There it is, then. The thing your father wanted, and my hammer took from him. Go on. Look at it properly. Everyone does, eventually, whether they mean to or not." Jon turned. He had expected, walking in, that the throne would feel like a relic, old iron, older grievance, a chair built from a war he had been born in the ashes of, and had no part in starting. He had not expected the particular, cold clarity that settled over him instead, standing this close to it for the first time. Not longing, not grief for a father he'd never known, not even the calculating hunger he'd half expected of himself, only recognition, the same recognition he felt looking at a ledger column that didn't sum. A problem, badly built, waiting for someone patient enough to solve it properly. Robert was still watching him, and something in his broad, ruined face had gone wary in a way it hadn't been a moment before. "You're looking at it like a man measuring a room for furniture," Robert said. Quiet now, all the earlier gruffness gone thin. "Not like a man looking at the thing that killed his father. Should I be looking at it differently, your Grace?" "I don't know," Robert said, and for the first time he sounded honestly uncertain. A king admitting a thing few kings ever admitted aloud. "I don't know what you should be looking at, boy. I've spent 16 years hoping I'd never have to find out." He drank the last of the wine and set the flagon down with more force than the gesture needed. "Go on. Get settled. Court'll want to look you over, pick you apart, decide what you're worth to them. Let them." His eyes, bloodshot and tired, held Jon's a moment longer than comfort allowed. "Just don't decide too quickly what I'm worth to you." Jon said nothing to that. He bowed, precisely as far as before, and left the king on his throne of blades to whatever private reckoning the wine hadn't yet drowned. Outside, in the corridor beyond the throne room doors, a woman with golden hair and a face carved from something colder than beauty watched him pass without troubling to hide that she was watching, and a few steps beyond her, a man in white armor with the same gold hair and a lazier, more considering smile did the same. Farther back, in shadow deep enough to be mistaken for accident, a bald man in soft slippers and a thin man with a mockingbird pin exchanged no words at all, which told Jon more than words would have. He walked on, past all of them, toward chambers he had not yet seen in a castle built by a dynasty he had just been told, in a locked archive a continent away, was rightfully his, and thought, without any heat in the thought at all, that an entrance like this one did not need a blade to be an act of war. It only needed everyone in the room to understand, all at once, that the war had already started, and that none of them yet knew whose side he was on. The small council chamber smelled of beeswax candles and old sea charts, and the table itself was long enough that a man seated at its foot could study every face down its length before anyone thought to study his. Jon had not been given a seat there. That distinction mattered, and he understood it the moment he crossed the threshold behind Robert's summons and found no chair set for him at all. Only a place to stand, near enough to the table to be addressed, far enough to remind everyone present that his presence was a favor, not a right. "Ah," said the bald man near the foot of the table, rising half out of his own seat in a show of courtesy that did not reach his eyes. "The prodigal returns to us at last. Lord Varys, your grace's master of whisperers, at your service, though I suspect you already knew that. One hears things in Dorne. One hears things everywhere if one listens closely enough." "I've heard your name," Jon said. "I've never heard your voice before. It's higher than I expected." Something flickered behind Varys's soft, powdered face. Not offense, something closer to recalculation. And beside him, a slim man with a neat beard and a mockingbird pin at his collar laughed once, low and pleased, as though Jon had just done him a small favor. "Lord Petyr Baelish," the man said before anyone else could introduce him, "Master of Coin. And I must say, Lord Sand, or is it Snow? I've quite lost track of what name you're wearing this season. You've a sharper tongue than I was told to expect from a boy raised by two men not known for their warmth." "They were warm enough when it suited them," Jon said. "I found most men are." Robert slouched at the head of the table with a cup already half drained, though the hour was early, waved a heavy hand toward the empty air beside him. "Enough courtesies. Sit him somewhere, someone, before he takes root standing there like a hitching post. We've a council to run." A stool was found, set some distance from the table proper, and Jon took it without complaint, because he had learned from Tywin that a man who protested his seat only confirmed how much the seat mattered to him. The matter at hand, it emerged within the first quarter hour, was Dornish grain, a shortfall in the Reach's harvest that had driven Highgarden's factors to seek supplement from Dorne's less fertile but better managed holdfasts, and a dispute over the tariff Casterly Rock's shipping lanes would extract for carrying it north. A small matter on its face. The kind of small matter Jon understood within the same quarter hour that existed in this room only as a pretext for something else entirely. "The tariff as proposed favors the Westerlands unduly," said Grand Maester Pycelle in a voice like dust settling. "Lord Tywin's factors would take a fifth of the grain's value merely for the crossing." "Lord Tywin's factors risk Lord Tywin's ships," Jon said before anyone else had finished drawing breath to answer. "A fifth is generous, given what the Reach would pay a Braavosi trading company for the same passage, with none of the protection a Lannister fleet provides against raiders working the stepstones this time of year." Silence, brief, while several faces along the table reassessed what exactly had just spoken up from the stool by the wall. "You'd know the raiding patterns in the stepstones," Varys said, mild as milk. "How precisely? I wasn't aware Casterly Rock shared its shipping intelligence quite so freely with its wards." "I read," Jon said. "Tywin Lannister keeps better records than most maesters, my lord, and he never once told me a document was too far above my station to study, provided I could explain what I'd learned from it afterward. I'd be glad to explain the Stepstone's current raiding season to the Council, if anyone doubts the figure. I have the specific ship names, if it would help." He did not have the specific ship names memorized, not all of them, but he had learned in Sunspear that the threat of specificity did nearly as much work as specificity itself, and that a man who offered proof too eagerly was rarely called upon to produce it. No one asked him to produce it. Littlefinger's smile had not moved, but something behind it had sharpened the particular attention of a man recalculating the odds on a wager he'd thought already settled. "You'll forgive me, Lord Sand, if I find it curious that a boy of 16 speaks so comfortably of ships and raiders and tariffs, as though he'd spent a lifetime at this table rather than a fortnight in this city. One begins to wonder what else you've been so thoroughly taught, out there among the sand and the spears. Whatever it was, Jon said, it seems to have prepared me better for this room than my birth alone would have. Your birth, Littlefinger repeated, savoring the word the way a man savors a coin he suspects is counterfeit, but hasn't yet decided how to prove it. Yes, that's rather the question everyone's too polite to ask directly, isn't it? Whose boy are you, precisely? The lions or the vipers? Or do you simply borrow whichever fang suits the moment? The table had gone quiet enough that Jon could hear the candles guttering. I'm the lions and the vipers both, my lord, Jon said, which means I've learned two very different ways of finding out what a man is hiding, and I've had cause in the short time I've been in this city to wonder what a master of coin might be hiding in a ledger no one else has thought to ask after. He let that sit a moment, unhurried, the way Oberyn let silence do work that words couldn't. I haven't looked yet. I only mention it because you seemed curious what I'd been taught. Littlefinger's smile did not falter, but his hand resting flat on the table went still in a way it hadn't been a moment before, and Jon understood with the particular satisfaction of a debt correctly called that he had just been believed rather than merely heard. Varys, for his part, had gone very quiet, his soft hands folded before him, watching Jon now with none of the earlier theater in his face at all. You make a great many implications for a boy who's held no seat at this table a full quarter hour, Varys said. And for the first time his voice had lost its practiced sweetness entirely. I'm not holding a seat, my lord, Jon said. I'm standing by the wall, on a stool someone found for me at the last moment. I've noticed everyone in this room seems very concerned with a boy who has neither a seat, a house, nor a name of his own. I find that more interesting than the grain tariff, honestly, though I suppose we should return to that, since His Grace has better things to do than watch the rest of you decide how frightened to be of me. Robert let out a short, surprised bark of laughter, the wine cup halfway to his mouth. Gods, he said. There's Tywin in that, sure enough. Never thought I'd hear something that dry out of a boy who spent half his raising among Dornish spearwives. The council moved on, eventually, to the tariff itself, and settled it at a figure closer to Jon's suggestion than anyone's pride would have preferred to admit. A small victory, procedural, forgettable to anyone watching who did not understand what had actually been decided in that room that morning. It was not until the council had emptied, candles guttering low, Robert already gone to whatever appetite called him loudest, that Jon found himself alone in the corridor outside with the two men who had tested him hardest, standing some small, deliberate distance apart from one another, the way men do who have long since stopped trusting the space between them. Varys inclined his head, first courteous again, the softness returned to his voice as though it had never left. A most illuminating morning, Lord Sand. I do hope we'll have many more like it. I hope so too, my lord, Jon said. I'm sure you'll let me know what you learn. Littlefinger's smile had recovered its earlier ease, but his eyes had not. You've made an interesting entrance into this city, he said. I wonder whether you've quite understood yet how many people are going to want to own a piece of it. I understood that before I ever set foot on the docks, Jon said. It's why I made sure no one house's colors rode ahead of the other. He left them there, in the candlelit corridor, neither man moving to follow, and did not look back to see whether they spoke to each other once he'd gone, though he suspected they didn't, that each of them, walking away in opposite directions, was already occupied with the same private, uneasy arithmetic, whether the boy who just unsettled them both in a single quarter hour was a threat to be removed early, while removal was still cheap, or a piece worth the risk of courting instead. Jon walked on alone toward chambers still unfamiliar to him, and thought, with no more heat than he'd felt looking at the Iron Throne itself, that he had just made the two most dangerous people in the capital into something, enemy or ally he genuinely could not yet say which, and understood that not knowing, for the moment, suited him perfectly well. The great sept's bells had barely stopped ringing before Prince Joffrey's wedding feast swallowed the Red Keep whole. 77 courses laid end to end, down the length of the throne room, dwarf jousters, singers, a pie big enough to hold a flock of doves that scattered shrieking into the rafters when it was cut. Jon stood near a pillar with a cup he had not touched since it was poured, and watched Joffrey Baratheon preside over his own wedding the way a man might preside over a kennel of dogs he found mildly amusing and wholly beneath him. You're not drinking, said a voice at his shoulder, and Jon did not need to turn to know it was Tyrion, wine already in hand, watching the high table with the particular weariness of a man who had spent a lifetime being smaller than the room and had long since stopped minding it out loud. "Neither are you, from the look of that cup," Jon said. "You've been holding it the same height for a quarter hour," an astute observation from a boy who's barely touched his own. Tyrion's mismatched eyes flicked up at him, sharp despite the wine already worked through the rest of him. "You've a strange stillness about you tonight, Lord Sand. Most men your age can't stop grinning at a feast like this. You look like a man waiting for a debt to come due." "Perhaps I am," Jon said. He had known for 3 days. The letter had come through a Dornish trading factor in Flea Bottom, unsigned in a hand he did not recognize but a cipher he did. One Oberyn had taught him years ago in the Water Gardens, folded inside a shipment manifest for saffron that no one at the docks had thought worth inspecting twice. "The little bird sings a new tune at the wedding feast. The lion's cub will choke on it. Watch the gates when the singing starts, and be ready to hold what falls loose." He had read it 4 times before he understood it was not a warning meant to be acted on by preventing anything at all. Now, up at the high table, Joffrey was laughing at something cruel he'd said to Tyrion a moment before, goblet raised, purple wine catching torchlight as he drained it in one long, satisfied swallow, and Jon watched, unmoving, as the laughter caught in the young prince's throat and turned, in the space of 2 heartbeats, into something else entirely. Joffrey's hands went to his neck first, then his face purpling, eyes bulging with a horror that had not yet found words to match it. He staggered from his chair, knocking his own wedding cup to shatter across the dais, and the sound that came out of him was not a scream so much as a wet, tearing gasp, the sound of a throat trying to close around itself. The hall dissolved into chaos in the space of a single breath. Cersei's shriek cut above everything else, raw and disbelieving, as she caught her son's collapsing weight against her skirts. Guards surged forward without any clear notion of what they were rushing toward. Somewhere a woman screamed that it was poison, and somewhere else a lord shouted for the Grand Maester, and beneath all of it Tyrion stood very still beside Jon, wine cup forgotten in his hand, staring at his nephew's dying convulsions with an expression that mixed horror and something that might, in a kinder light, have been relief. Jon set his own cup down, untouched, on the pillar's ledge, and did not move to help. He had 3 days to prepare for this moment, and he had not spent them wondering whether to save the boy. Joffrey Baratheon, blue-lipped and dying in his own wedding finery, was not a life Jon had any interest in prolonging, and no version of Tywin's arithmetic or Oberyn's patience suggested otherwise. What mattered, in the roaring confusion of that hall, was not the boy choking on the floor. It was the fact that every guard, every lord, every Kingsguard sworn to a house now scrambling for its own survival, had their eyes fixed entirely on the dais, and none of them were watching the gates. Jon slipped from the hall through a side passage he had scouted a week before, on the pretext of admiring the Red Keep's older architecture, and found Ser Balon Swan still posted at the outer yard, pale and uncertain, torn between his oath to guard the feast and the screaming coming from inside it. "Ser Balon," Jon said. "The City Watch commander, Sir Vylar, is it? Where's he stationed tonight?" "The gatehouse, my lord. Same as always, but send a man to fetch him. Tell him the crown needs the watch doubled at every gate before the news of this reaches the streets, or Flea Bottom will be looting the street of silk before the boy's even cold. Tell him it comes from the small council, not from me. He won't take an order from a name he doesn't recognize, but he'll take one from the council fast enough, and by the time anyone thinks to ask which council member actually gave it, there won't be time to unwind it." Balon, young and frightened, and grateful for anything resembling an order in a night that had none, went. It took less than an hour. Jon moved through the yard and the gatehouses that followed with the calm of a man auditing a ledger rather than a man exploiting a murder. A word here to a watch captain he'd quietly paid 3 months' coin in advance through a Dornish intermediary who owed him a debt neither of them had ever named aloud. A reminder there, to a Lannister sworn lieutenant, of a gambling debt to a Sunspear merchant that could vanish or could ruin him, depending entirely on whose favor he curried by morning. A whispered assurance to Vylar himself, once the man was found, that the crown, meaning unspoken but understood, whichever crown still stood upright by dawn, would remember which commander had kept the city calm on the worst night in a generation, and which had let it burn. By the time the maesters had confirmed what half the hall already knew, poison, strangler's blood, a killer still unnamed, the City Watch answered, gate by gate, captain by captain, to men who owed their positions and their silence, to a boy no one in that chaos had thought to watch at all, Jon returned to the hall as the body was carried out, wrapped now Cersei's screaming reduced to a low, raw, continuous sound that was somehow worse than the screaming had been. He took up a position near the same pillar, cup still untouched where he'd left it, and watched the aftermath the way he watched a ledger settle after a difficult column. Not with satisfaction exactly, but with the particular quiet of a man who has confirmed that his arithmetic held. Tyrion was still there too, considerably paler than before, staring at Jon now with an expression that had shed all its wine-softened wariness. "You didn't move," Tyrion said, quiet, careful. "Not once. Not to help, not to flee, not even to look surprised. I watched you, Lord Sand, in the middle of all that, and you looked like a man watching weather he'd already been told was coming. Everyone in this hall is grieving or terrified tonight, my lord," Jon said. "I didn't think it my place to perform either." "That's not an answer. It's the only one I have." Tyrion studied him a moment longer, something working behind his mismatched eyes that he did not say aloud, and then moved off toward whatever remained of his family, leaving Jon alone by the pillar in a hall still ringing with a grief that was not his, in a city that had, in the span of one evening, quietly changed hands without a single blade drawn to mark it. It was near dawn, the hall mostly emptied, servants scrubbing purple wine and worse from the dais stones, when Cersei found him. She had washed her face, or someone had washed it for her, but nothing had washed the look out of her eyes, red-rimmed, hollow, and fixed on Jon with an intensity that had nothing left in it of the cool, cataloging contempt she'd worn on his first day in the city. "My son," she said low, "is not yet cold, and already I hear the city watch answers to men I've never authorized. At gates my own guard should command." Her hands folded before her were shaking just slightly in a way Jon suspected she did not know they were doing. "I don't yet know how you did it. I don't yet know if you had a single hand in what happened to him tonight." She stepped closer, close enough that Jon could see the grief and the calculation both, twisted together now in a way that would never fully come apart again. "But I know you didn't grieve for him. I watched you not grieve for him, while every other soul in this hall wept or screamed, or prayed. And I have learned, Lord Sand, over a very long and very bitter life, that the man who doesn't weep at a death is very often the man who understood it best." She left him there without waiting for an answer, and Jon did not offer one because there was nothing he could have said that would have made her wrong. Jaime Lannister found him on the training yard's edge 9 days after the wedding, still in his white cloak though the boy he'd sworn to protect lay a week in his tomb, and there was nothing lazy left in the way he moved. "You've been busy," Jaime said. "No greeting first. 9 days, and I count 4 watch captains who'd have sworn their lives to my sister a fortnight ago, now taking their orders from a runner who says only that it comes from the council. Strange that. Stranger still that the runner always seems to trace back to you, and never quite far enough to prove it." "The city needed calm after the wedding," Jon said. "Someone had to give the orders. No one else was giving any. My sister gave orders. Her orders were countermanded within the hour, gate, by men who owe you something I haven't yet worked out how to name." Jaime's hand rested, easy but not idle, on the pommel of his sword. "I served that boy's father before him. I know what it looks like when a man builds himself an army out of favors instead of steel, because I watched Tywin do exactly that for 30 years. You did it in a night. If you have an accusation, Sir Jaime, I'd rather hear it plainly than guess at it." "Plainly, then." Jaime's golden eyes had none of their old, bored amusement left in them. "I think you knew that boy was going to die before the wine touched his lips. I think you spent the chaos of his dying buying yourself a city while the rest of us buried a child. And I think a man who can do that without his hand shaking is either innocent in a way I've never once seen in this castle, or guilty of something worse than poison." He drew a slow breath. "I want it settled. Not with whispers in a council chamber. With steel, where everyone can watch it settled honestly." "You're calling for trial by combat," Jon said. "Over an accusation you can't prove. I'm calling for it because it's the one thing in this city no one can buy their way around." Jaime's mouth twisted, something almost like respect buried under the anger. "Choose your champion, Lord Sand, or stand yourself. Either way, by tomorrow's dusk, this city will know whether the boy raised by lions and vipers bleeds like the rest of us." Robert, when the matter reached him that evening, was too deep in wine and grief of his own to do more than wave a heavy hand and mutter that the gods could sort it out if his own counsel couldn't be trusted to. Words spoken in front of enough lords at table that no formal writ was needed to make them binding. By morning, every man in the training yard understood the trial stood sanctioned by the crown itself, which was, Jon understood, as good as a royal seal on the whole affair. He chose to stand himself. A champion would have implied he needed one. An implication in the city spread faster than any confession. Word reached him within the hour of who Jaime intended to put forward if Jon had not chosen himself. Sir Balman Byarch, a Tyrell knight of considerable size and greater reputation, sent north with a Tyrell delegation for exactly this kind of occasion. A man who had broken 3 lances and one opponent's collarbone in a single Highgarden tourney and had never once in a dozen trials lost. Jaime withdrew the offer the moment Jon named himself instead, disappointed in a way that suggested he'd wanted, more than anything, to see whether Jon would hide behind someone else's steel. He had not. That alone bought Jon something in Jaime's cold estimation that no amount of council maneuvering ever could have. The morning of the trial, Jon laid out his armor and weapon on a table in his borrowed chamber, and studied them the way he'd once studied a ledger that refused to sum. Lannister plate, forged at Casterly Rock's own smithies and sent south with him at Tywin's order months before, without explanation, the way Tywin sent everything. A gift that was also a test, a message that was also a debt. Steel worked thick at the breastplate and thighs, heavier than Dornish fighters ever wore, built for men who intended to stand in one place and let an opponent exhaust himself against it. Beside it, his spear, ash-shafted, Valyrian-forged head, the weapon Oberyn had put into his hands the same week he'd put a vial of poison into them, and called both the same lesson. He chose both. Not one philosophy over the other. Both, worn and wielded together, the way he had been raised to be both and had never once, in 8 years at Casterly Rock or 8 in Sunspear, been permitted to be only one. The poison he mixed himself, in the gray hour before dawn, from a case Oberyn had sent north with him sealed and unmarked, the way a father sends a son off with a blade he trusts him to use wisely. Not the killing draught, the paralytic, thin and colorless, meant to steal the strength from a man's limbs within a dozen heartbeats of breaking the skin, without stopping his heart at all. Oberyn had taught him the difference between the 2 years before with the same patient precision he'd once used to explain the water gardens. A dead man teaches you nothing further. A man who lives, broken and beaten in front of a watching city, teaches everyone. The yard was packed to its walls by midday, lords and small folk both pressed against every rail. Cersei seated pale and rigid in the royal box with Tyrion beside her, watching with an expression Jon could not read from that distance and did not try to. Sir Balman Birch entered the lists in Tyrell green and gold, a warhammer slung easy across one shoulder, built like a man who had never once in his life needed to think about footwork. Jon entered opposite him in lion crimson plate and no house colors at all beyond it, spear held low, and heard the crowd's murmur shift from curiosity to something closer to disbelief at the sheer mismatch of size between them. The first quarter hour went almost entirely to Byarch. The warhammer came down again and again in short, brutal arcs, and Jon gave ground each time, plate ringing under blows that would have shattered lighter armor outright. His spear used only to deflect, never to strike, the ash shaft cracking twice under the strain of glancing hits he let land rather than risk. His arms ached inside the plate, his breath came ragged. Twice he stumbled, deliberately, and let the crowd gasp at what looked like weakness, and felt Birch's confidence swell with every gasp the way Oberyn had once told him an enemy's pride always swelled fastest right before it killed him. "Standing there won't save you forever, boy," Birch said, breathing hard himself now despite his size, sweat cutting through the dust on his face. "Lannister steel's heavy. Heavy tires a man faster than it protects him." "It's protected me for a quarter hour," Jon said, and did not sound half as tired as his body actually was. "How long has that hammer been protecting you?" Birch came in for what he clearly meant as the finishing blow, hammer raised high and wide, all his weight committed to a single crushing arc, and Jon, who had spent a quarter hour learning the exact rhythm of that raised arm, the exact half-second gap it opened at the man's exposed forearm every time he wound up for a killing swing, stepped inside the arc rather than away from it. The spearhead found the narrow gap between vambrace and gauntlet, the same gap Oberyn had drilled him against 100 times in the Sunspear yard, and it barely broke the skin at all, a shallow line, no deeper than a shaving cut, gone almost before the crowd could register it had landed. Byarch laughed, short and contemptuous, certain the boy had missed his one real chance. Then his hammer arm began, very slightly, to shake. Within 10 heartbeats the shaking had spread to his shoulder. Within 20 the hammer's weight had become too much for fingers that no longer answered him properly, and it fell from his grip to ring dully against the packed earth. Birch stared at his own hand as though it belonged to someone else, understanding dawning across his face a moment before his legs understood it too, and folded beneath him, dropping him to his knees in the dust, alive, breathing, utterly unable to lift so much as a finger against the boy now standing over him, with a spear point resting light against his throat. "Yield," Jon said, quiet enough that only the front rows heard it, though the whole yard had gone silent enough to carry it anyway. "Can't," Birch managed, through a jaw gone thick and clumsy. "Can't move my own tongue right, boy. What did you—" "Poison," Jon said. "Not enough to kill you. Enough to prove I could have." He straightened, spear lifted away, and raised his voice to carry to the royal box and every rail beyond it. "Sir Bowman Birch cannot continue. I claim the trial." The silence held a moment longer, and then broke into something that was not quite cheering, and not quite horror, but a great deal closer to the second, the sound of an entire city understanding, all at once, that the boy raised by two of the most dangerous men in Westeros had just shown them exactly how he'd been raised, and had chosen, deliberately, to let every one of them watch him do it. Jaime Lannister, standing at the rail with his sword hand loose at his side, said nothing at all as Jon walked from the lists, though his eyes followed him the whole way, and in them was neither the earlier suspicion nor anything like satisfaction, only the particular, wary respect of a man who has just watched a weapon he helped forge prove sharper than he'd ever intended it to be. The boar had gored Robert Baratheon on a hunt not 3 leagues from the city, and by the time the litter bore him back through the gates, his body had already gone the color of spoiled meat beneath the bandages, and everyone who looked at him understood, before the maesters said a word, that the king was already more corpse than man. Jon stood at the foot of the royal bed with the rest of the council, close enough to hear the wet rattling breath but far enough back that no one could later claim he'd crowded a dying king's last hours. For advantage, Cersei sat closest, dry-eyed now in a way that unsettled Jon more than tears would have. A woman who had already finished grieving one son and had nothing left over for a husband she'd stopped loving before Jon had ever been born. "Ned," Robert said once, thick and wandering, eyes fixed on nothing in the chamber at all. "Ned, tell the boy, tell him—" He never finished it. Whatever instruction he meant to leave died somewhere behind his teeth, and within the hour the rattling stopped, and the Red Keep's bells began the slow, mournful toll that told the city its king was gone. The council reconvened before the body had cooled, and Jon understood within the first exchange of it that the true battle of the evening would not be fought over grief, but over who controlled the silence that followed it. "There is no true heir," Grand Maester Pycelle said, wringing his hands in a show of sorrow that convinced no one. "Prince Joffrey is dead. Prince Tommen is a child of 8. The Baratheon succession itself is contested by Robert's own brothers. Varys finished for him, mild as ever, both of whom will have heard of the king's death within a fortnight, and will both, I expect, be raising banners before the month is out. Stannis will say he has the law," Littlefinger said, though a council that's just finished burying one poisoning at a wedding might reasonably wonder how settled anyone's claim to anything really is these days. "Renly has the charm and the Tyrell swords regardless. Between the two of them they'll tear the realm in half, fighting over who deserves it more, and neither will spare a thought for who's actually sitting in this city while they do it." Every eye at the table, however carefully most of them tried to disguise it, went briefly to Jon. He said nothing at first. He had learned across 2 council sessions and a trial fought in front of half the city that silence in this room did more work than argument, and that the men who filled silence too quickly were the men who'd already lost whatever hand they were playing. "Tommen is the true-born heir by every law this council has ever recognized," Jon said at last. "I'd suggest the council recognize him as such, formally before Stannis or Renly can claim the throne sits empty. A boy king with a strong council behind him is still a king. An empty throne is an invitation." "And who?" Cersei said, voice flat, eyes on him with the same hollow, calculating grief she'd worn since the wedding. "Would you suggest sits on that council, Lord Sand, now that my husband and my son are both in the ground within the same fortnight? Whoever can hold the city together long enough for the war outside its walls to exhaust itself," Jon said, "rather than let it spread inside them too." He did not say his own name, he did not need to. Every person at that table understood exactly whose hands already held the city watch, gate by gate, captain by captain, and understood, watching him decline to claim it aloud, that the declining was itself a kind of claim. The weeks that followed moved the way a slow siege moves, no single dramatic blow, only pressure, applied in a dozen quiet places at once. Jon met with Cersei 3 times in as many weeks, always alone, always in ruse she chose to control the meeting, and always leaving having given her something small enough to seem like a gift, and large enough to bind her to him a little further. A rumor confirmed that a Tyrell shipment of grain meant for Highgarden's own granaries had been quietly diverted toward Renly's growing camp at Storm's End. True, and useful, and delivered to Cersei with just enough warmth to make her believe she'd earned his loyalty rather than been fed exactly what he wished her to know. "You could have told the council this," Cersei said, turning the report over in her hands. "Why bring it to me alone? Because the council leaks like a rotted hull, my lady, and you already know which of them is doing the leaking," Jon said. "I'd rather you trust one source completely than trust 6 half as much." She studied him a long moment, something wary and almost grateful moving behind her eyes. "You sound like my father. I was raised by him for 8 years. It would be strange if I didn't." A letter went south the same week, through the same Dornish trading channels that had once carried Oberyn's cipher warning of the wedding, informing Sunspear, through Oberyn. Through the network Jon had spent 2 years quietly building, and had never once mentioned to a soul in this castle that Cersei's small council had begun making overtures to Highgarden behind Dorne's back. A marriage proposal floated between a Lannister cousin and a minor Tyrell daughter that would, if it succeeded, tie the West and the Reach together, and leave Dorne isolated on the losing side of whatever war followed. It was, like the grain report to Cersei, true in its bones and shaped in its telling, enough truth to be believed instantly, enough shaping to ensure Oberyn's answering letter, when it came, was suspicious rather than reassured. "Keep them looking at each other, little dragon," Oberyn wrote back. "In the old cipher, no signature needed. A house watching its neighbor for betrayal has no eyes left over to watch you." Margaery Tyrell arrived at court in the last week of that month, ostensibly to pay respects for a king she'd never once met and a boy husband her own house had buried within the same season, and found herself seated beside Jon at supper on her second night in the city, through an arrangement of place cards that no one present could quite recall having ordered. "You've a reputation already," Margaery said. Over wine she barely touched, watching him with the same frank, assessing warmth Jon had learned to recognize as a Tyrell trait rather than a personal one. "Half the court thinks you a Lannister spy in Dornish silk. The other half thinks you a Dornish assassin wearing lion colors as a disguise. I confess I find both theories a little dull. What's your theory, my lady?" "That you're neither, and that's precisely what frightens them." She turned her cup slowly by its stem. "My grandmother sent me north with instructions to find out which house you truly serve, so Highgarden knows which side to court before the fighting starts in earnest. I've been at this table 20 minutes, and I already suspect the honest answer is going to disappoint her terribly." "Which answer is that?" "That you serve whichever house is foolish enough to think it's bought you," Margaery said, smiling in a way that held no malice in it at all, while quietly making certain none of them ever actually have. Jon returned her smile, careful, unhurried. Highgarden's grain trade with Dorne could use a friendlier tariff than the last council session set. He said, "I could see it revised if a friendship between our houses seemed worth building slowly, over time, rather than rushed into before either of us knows what we'd actually be buying." "A courtship with no proposal in it," Margaery said, delighted despite herself. "How very careful of you. I've found careful outlasts hasty in most things that matter." She left 3 days later without a formal arrangement of any kind, though the tariff was quietly revised within the fortnight, and a standing correspondence began between them that committed neither house to the other, while ensuring both continued, patiently, to hope they might. By the time word reached King's Landing that Stannis Baratheon had raised his stag and flame banners at Dragonstone, and Renly had done the same at Storm's End, with the full weight of Highgarden's roses behind him, and further word still that Robb Stark had called his northern banners and marched south to answer for a father Jon had never once had cause to grieve properly, the war those 3 claims promised had not yet touched King's Landing at all. The Watch answered to captains who owed Jon their advancement. The small council split its trust 3 ways, Cersei believing herself protected by a boy grateful for her favor, Varys and Littlefinger each convinced, separately, that Jon's true loyalty lay with the other and had simply not yet been proven, and the granaries, the gates, and the gold cloaks of the capital moved, in every practical sense that mattered, at the direction of a boy with no seat at the council table and no house name at all. Jon stood one evening on the same battlement he'd first crossed on his arrival, watching the city's torches spread gold beneath him in the dark. 3 armies gathering at its edges, and none of them yet close enough to matter, and thought that a throne, it turned out, could be taken quietly, one favor and one fear at a time, long before a single sword was ever drawn to claim it properly. Tywin Lannister arrived with an army at his back, and no warning sent ahead of it, which told Jon, before a single word passed between them, that his old teacher had already decided this visit was not a courtesy call. The West's banners filled the King's Road for the better part of a day before the column itself reached the gates. 12,000 men by the watch captain's count, more than enough to remind a city still bleeding gold and confidence, exactly whose grain had fed it through a lean season, and whose swords had kept the Stepstone's raiders off its shipping lanes. Tywin rode at the head of it in plain armor, no ostentation beyond the lion crest at his shoulder, and Jon watched from the same battlement he'd stood on a fortnight before, and understood that the man riding toward the Red Keep had not come to pay respects to a dead king. He had come to collect what he believed was owed him. The summons to the Tower of the Hand came within the hour of Tywin's arrival, delivered by a steward who did not meet Jon's eyes, and Jon climbed the stairs alone, unarmed, the way a man walks into a ledger audit he has already decided he will not lose. Tywin was seated behind the Hand's own desk when Jon entered, as though he had already claimed the office by right rather than request. Papers spread before him in the same precise, unhurried arrangement Jon remembered from a room a continent away, and 8 years gone. He did not rise, he did not for a long moment even look up. "Sit," Tywin said. Jon sat. "You've done well," Tywin said, at last setting down his quill with the same deliberate finality he'd used to close every lesson Jon had ever learned from him. "Better than well. The City Watch answers through channels that trace, eventually, back to men who owe you rather than the crown. The small council splits its confidences 3 ways, and trusts none of them fully. Cersei believes you her creature. Varys and Littlefinger each believe you the others. In 4 months you have built, out of nothing but favors and patience, precisely the kind of quiet ownership of a city that I spent 30 years building for House Lannister." He folded his hands. "I taught you that. I am aware I taught you that. What I did not teach you, apparently, was to whom the result belongs." "I never asked whose it belonged to," Jon said. "You taught me to solve problems. You never told me the solution had to serve you specifically once it was solved." "It was implied," Tywin said, "in every lesson I ever gave you, in every debt I let you call and every ruin I let you engineer under my roof. You were raised on Lannister gold, Lannister patience. What you've built with it belongs to the house that built you." "I was raised on Lannister gold for 8 years," Jon said, "and Martell patience for 8 more. You'll forgive me if I never found the ledger that said one debt canceled the other." Something moved behind Tywin's pale green eyes. Not anger, not yet, but the particular cold recalibration of a man discovering an error in a column he had trusted absolutely. "You've been careful," Tywin said. "I'll grant you that. Careful enough that I cannot, sitting in this chamber, point to a single treasonous act. No blade drawn against the crown. No open defiance of this council, only favors, quietly called, and a boy standing at the center of it all claiming, to anyone who asks, that he serves no house but the realm's own stability." His mouth thinned. "That is, I confess, the finest piece of work I have ever seen out of a student, and I include Cersei and Jaime in that accounting, though it pains me to say so of children who share my own blood outright." "Is that a compliment, my lord?" "It is an observation," Tywin said, "and observations, in my experience, precede corrections." He drew a fresh sheet of paper toward him, and Jon recognized, even upside down, the particular hand of a Lannisport factor's ledger. "You'll dismantle it. The watch captains return to answering the crown directly, through this council, which is to say, through me, as hand. Whatever private arrangements you've built with Cersei, with the Tyrells, with your Dornish correspondence, you'll unwind quietly, the same patient way you built them, and you'll do it within the month." "And if I don't?" "Then you'll learn," Tywin said, without heat, the way he had once explained a column that failed to some, that a lion raised in captivity is still in the end a lion, and that the men who forget that distinction rarely live to correct the mistake twice. Jon said nothing for a moment. He let the silence sit the way Oberyn had taught him silence could sit, doing work no argument could match, and watched Tywin wait him out with the same patience Jon himself had learned at this man's own knee. "You came to King's Landing with 12,000 men," Jon said finally, "which tells me you expected either obedience or open war, and prepared for neither the possibility that I might simply show you the numbers instead. What numbers? Jon drew from beneath his doublet a folded paper of his own. Not smuggled, not stolen, but assembled openly over 3 months from records any council member could have requested, and none had thought to, the way Tywin himself had once taught him that the most dangerous documents were rarely hidden, only ignored. The crown's debt to the Iron Bank of Braavos, Jon said, stands at 6 million gold dragons, accrued across Robert's reign and largely unpaid since his death. Casterly Rock has carried the greater share of the crown's remaining obligations to its own coffers, which means House Lannister's fortune is presently bound up in a debt owed by a throne currently contested by 3 separate claimants, none of whom have shown the slightest interest in honoring an obligation they didn't incur. He set the paper down between them, the way Oberyn had once set down a vial for Jon to study. Stannis will repudiate the debt outright if he wins, on the grounds it was Robert's folly, not the realm's. Renly will renegotiate it downward and call the difference a wedding gift to whichever house backs his claim, which will not be yours given how thoroughly you've already offended Highgarden this past year over Marjorie's marriage prospects. Even Robb Stark, should the North somehow prevail, owes House Lannister nothing but a grudge for a father who died in this city's dungeons. Tywin's face had not moved, but something in the room's temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees regardless. "You're suggesting House Lannister's fortune is at risk?" Tywin said flat. "I'm suggesting it already is, my lord, and has been since the moment Robert died with no clear heir and 3 armies in the field. I merely noticed it before your factors did." Jon leaned forward slightly. "The Iron Bank does not care whose sigil sits the throne. It cares who can guarantee repayment. Right now that guarantee runs through King's Landing's granaries, its shipping lanes, its city watch. Every practical lever of the crown's actual solvency, all of which happen to answer, at present, to captains loyal to me rather than to any council seat. You can dismantle that tomorrow, as you've ordered. And within the season, when the bank's factors come asking who actually controls the city's ability to pay its debts, you'll have no honest answer to give them beyond your own name, which currently guarantees nothing but the West's grain harvest and an army 12,000 strong that eats gold faster than any harvest replaces it." The silence that followed was longer than any Jon had ever earned from this man before. In 8 years of ledger rooms and correct answers, delivered a heartbeat too late. "You've turned Castemir's own logic against me," Tywin said at last, and there was something in his voice Jon had never once heard there before. Not quite alarm, not quite grief, but some cold, private cousin of both. Overwhelming force applied once, so thoroughly the enemy cannot recover. I taught you that lesson standing over the ruin of House Serret, and you've used it to leave House Lannister with an army it cannot afford to keep fed, and a debt it cannot afford to be seen, unable to pay. I learned it from the best teacher in Westeros, Jon said. I never claimed I'd only use it once. For a moment, watching the man across the desk, pale, still, the closest Jon had ever seen him come to a wound he could not immediately calculate his way around, Jon felt something small and cold turn over behind his ribs, the same flinch he'd suppressed 8 years before in a ledger room lit yellow and unmoving, over a daughter's ruined betrothal he'd been told did not matter. It rose in him now, unbidden, watching the man who'd raised him absorb a ruin of his own making, and this time Jon let it surface fully across his face before he corrected it. The way Tywin himself had once told him a correction delivered a breath too late was still technically correct. Tywin saw it. Of course he saw it. He had spent 8 years teaching Jon to read a still face for its smallest variations, and he read this one now with the particular, exhausted clarity of a man recognizing his own reflection in a mirror he had built himself. "You hesitated," Tywin said. "Quiet." "I recalculated," Jon said. The answer didn't change. Tywin looked at him a long moment longer, something moving behind his cold green eyes that might, in a warmer man, have been called grief for a thing he had made too well, and then he looked down at the paper between them and did not look up again. "Get out of my sight," he said, without anger, without volume, the voice of a man who has just finished auditing a column and found at the bottom of it a sum he cannot dispute. "I have a debt to consider, and an army to feed on a treasury that no longer answers to my name." Jon rose, bowed exactly as far as he ever had, and left the Hands Tower with the particular, quiet weight of a student who has just watched his master's doctrine turn, precisely as designed, into his master's undoing. The small council chamber had never been full quite this way before, every seat taken, and beyond the seats, standing room claimed by men who had no formal right to be there at all but had made certain, through channels Jon had spent a year building, that no one thought to turn them away. Tywin sat at the foot of the table now, not the head, a placement he had not argued when the seating was arranged, which told Jon more than any speech could have. The West's army had withdrawn from the city gates 3 days before. Quietly, its supply lines already too costly to maintain against a debt no one could guarantee. But the boy who'd shown him the numbers, "The realm requires a settled crown," Varys said, into a silence that had already decided its own answer and was only waiting for someone to say it aloud first. Stannis Baratheon sits at Dragonstone with the law behind him and no army large enough to take this city by force. Renly is dead, a blade sworn to guard him, or so the story goes, and I've no cause to doubt a story that convenient. Robb Stark marches south seeking justice for a father, not a throne, and has said so plainly to every lord who'll listen. None of them can hold King's Landing. One of them already does. "Say it plainly, my lord," Cersei said, voice worn thin by grief that had curdled weeks ago into something closer to exhaustion. "You mean the boy." "I mean the boy," Varys agreed. Jon stood where he had always stood in this room. No seat claimed, not even now, though a chair had been left conspicuously empty at the table's near end for the better part of a month, waiting on him to take it. He looked at the empty chair and did not sit. "I have no claim," Jon said. "Not a legal one this council would recognize. I hold no house name. Robert's decree stripped the only one I was born to before I could speak it myself." "You hold the watch," Littlefinger said, dry. "You hold the granaries. You hold a debt to the Iron Bank that only your name currently guarantees payment on, and half this council besides, whether we admit it in this room or only in our private letters home. Legitimacy is a story men tell to make power feel earned, Lord Sand. You've spent a year proving you don't need the story to have the power. I'd have thought, by now, you understood which of those two things actually matters." "Then let the council say what it means," Jon said, instead of circling it. "You want me to sit that throne." "We want the realm to stop bleeding," Pycelle said, older and grayer than he'd been a year before. "Whether that's accomplished by a claim of blood or a claim of competence, I confess I no longer have the strength to insist on the distinction." Jon looked, last, at Tywin. The old man's face gave him nothing, no pride, no grief, no argument left in it at all, only the flat, exhausted patience of a teacher watching a lesson he had built with his own hands arrive at its final sum. "You'd have made a fine hand," Tywin said, quiet enough that only the nearest heard it. "You'll make a stranger king. I find, to my own considerable surprise, that I no longer much care which so long as the debt is paid and the West keeps its harvest." The coronation was held 11 days later. On a morning bright and cold, the Sept crowded past its doors with lords who had spent the last year deciding, one by one, that a boy who could not be bought was preferable to 3 claimants who could not be trusted. Jon had refused the crown 3 separate craftsmen brought him before settling on the 4th design. No dragons worked into the metal, no stag antlers, nothing that reached backward toward a father he had never known, or a house that had exiled him twice over before he could speak for himself. Black steel, plain and heavy, forged in a single unbroken band, no jewels, no houses declared, because the crown was not meant to say whose son he was. It was meant to say what he had built instead. The banner that rose above the Red Keep's highest tower that morning was new to every eye in the city. A lion's head, worked in gold thread, its jaw closed around the coiled body of a viper whose tail became at its tip the head of a spear. No red field, no orange. A field the deep black of Valyrian steel, chosen because it belonged to no house that had come before it, and could not therefore be claimed by any that followed. "They'll call it presumptuous," Tyrion said, standing beside Jon in the Sept's antechamber, as the Septons chanting rose beyond the doors, wine cup in hand, though his eyes for once were entirely clear, a sigil with no history behind it, worn by a king with no name to match it. "Every sigil had no history once," Jon said. "Someone simply had to be the first to wear it." "You could have taken the dragon," Tyrion said. "You've the blood for it, whatever this council pretends not to know. Half the small folk in this city already whisper it in the alehouses, and I doubt very much they're wrong." "The dragon burned this city once already," Jon said. "I've no wish to remind anyone what it looked like the last time it sat that throne." Tyrion studied him a long moment, something wry and a little sad moving behind his mismatched eyes. you're a strange kind of king, John Sand, or whatever they'll call you by evening. You've spent a year taking everything a throne is actually made of, the gold, the gates, the debts, the fear, and you've refused at every turn to take the one thing that would have made claiming it simple. The name never made anything simple, John said. It only made it fast. The doors opened, and he walked the length of the sept alone. Past faces he had spent a year learning to read. Cersei, hollow-eyed and watching with an expression that had never fully resolved itself into either trust or hatred. Varys and Littlefinger, seated some deliberate distance apart, each still privately convinced the other had lost more in this arrangement than they had. Tywin, upright and silent, a man auditing, one final time a column that would not change no matter how many times he checked its sum. At the sept's edge, near the door, a small delegation stood apart from the rest, a stag-and-flame banner held stiff and unhappy by a man John recognized from description as one of Stannis' household knights, sent to observe rather than to kneel, and beside him, travel-worn and grim, 2 riders in gray and white who had arrived from the north only that morning, too late to prevent the coronation and, John suspected, not entirely sorry for the timing. None of them bent the knee, none of them needed to, not yet. They had come only to watch, and to carry word home of exactly what kind of king now sat where 3 armies had each hoped to place their own. He reached the dais where the Iron Throne waited, its 1,000 blades catching the sept's high windows and throwing the light back in 100 broken pieces, and did not hesitate the way Tywin had once told him a hesitation, arriving a breath too late, was still, in its own way, a correction admitted. He let himself feel it this time, the small, cold thing turning over behind his ribs, that he had suppressed once in a ledger room over a daughter's ruined betrothal, and suppressed again in a hand's tower over a teacher's quiet ruin, and did not correct his face at all. No one in that sept watching a boy climb toward a chair built from a rebellion he had not started, could have said afterward whether what crossed his expression in that moment was triumph, grief, or something with no name yet invented for it. Perhaps, John thought, sitting at last upon blades that had killed his father's line, and now, somehow, held his own weight instead, that was precisely the point of a face no one could read cleanly, that a king built on ledgers and poison, on favors called and debts collected, owed no one in this hall the comfort of a simple answer. The septon's voice rose to declare him, and the black and gold banner snapped once, hard in a wind that had come up off the bay, and the sept below him filled with a sound that was not quite a cheer and never fully became one, the particular, uneasy quiet of a city that had gotten exactly the king it needed, and understood, watching him settle onto that throne with neither joy nor regret plain on his face, that it had no earthly idea what it had actually just crowned. Let us know what you'd like to see next. The end